Hi, everyone. It's me, Tim. Today, I want to talk about technological evolution. Specifically, I'm going to try to answer a question from David Deckham 411, who asks, what was your experience with the technological evolution we've gone through during your time making and playing games? Was it ever a source of stress, or were you excited to keep up? I'll give you the TLDW. It was exciting and stressful. I'll have to go back a long time ago to explain it, but like even when I was a kid, we started getting little handheld games like Coleco football and things like that. And then suddenly there was a Pong unit out, which you hooked up to the TV. And then within a year or two, there was a console, the first console, Atari VCS, which took cartridges. And you're like, whoa, it started playing games that looked like they were in the arcade. And you were like, whoa, this is crazy. That led to all kinds of things, ColecoVision and television, Nintendo, just things just kept coming and coming and coming. As a consumer, it's fun, but also you had to realize that you could buy something and then literally the next year, sometimes 6 months later, it was obsolete. That really hit the stride with PCs. You would buy a PC and it would be obsolete within months as a better sound card or video card or processor or monitor came out. So I'm not going to talk about that side. I'm not talking about the consumer side. I'm going to talk about my experience starting in 1981 of trying to make games where your target was constantly shifting. And this is the thing I've always told people, the huge difference between writing a book or making a movie or making a TV show is the pace of technological change in those don't hold a candle to computer. I mean, yes, they've developed new cameras and different lighting solutions and better microphones. But in general, directing is the same now as it was maybe 20 years ago, 40 years ago. That's not how it works in computer games. Every time something changed technologically, it would make old games not work. It would open up a plethora of choices you could make for new games. Way different than movies now have color, movies now have sound. We're talking, you couldn't do realistic graphics. Now you can. How realistic? You can add in cutscenes. How many? Well, now we have CD-ROMs. You can add a ton. You have space for way more data. We can make higher resolution art. We can just, it expanded exponentially, it felt like every year. And it was keep up or die. So let me walk through some of these choices I made. So the very first game I made that I started around 83 and it shipped in 86 was Grand Slam Bridge. It may look like it's graphical, but this is all text-based. This was put together in a text mode using ASCII characters that already existed. We didn't even have to define any. So because of this, it worked on any PC. It still works. Was a very interesting way of doing a game. Now, I then went off to grad school for a few years, and when I dove back in to making games in 91 with Bard's Tale Construction Set, suddenly I was doing a game in VGA. And VGA was the new hot thing in a sense because when we did Bard's Tale Construction Set, we had to put in support for the old mode, EGA, and the even older mode, CGA. So VGA for 32200 resolution gave us 256 colors, but EGA only gave us 16. CGA only gave us 4, and those 4 were predefined. It was black, white, magenta, and some purpley color. I don't remember what it was, or maybe it was magenta and mauve. And there were 2 different CGA modes. You either got black, white, and these 2 colors, or black and white and these 2 colors, predefined. So good luck making graphics you want in a low resolution where you can't even pick the colors you want. Now, by the time I started Fallout in 94, in early 94, in fact, I had to work this out exactly when I started. I started working on it probably January 94, because yes, I'm putting together a timeline for many reasons. But the very first meeting with Steve Jackson Games to talk about GURPS for the new game was in March 94. And that's where I can put a pin in it. I know the game was definitely in development by March of 94. It was just me. No one else would be assigned to it until August of that year. But I can say for sure in March 94, but probably a month or two earlier, by January or February, Fallout had begun development. By that time, VGA, this is what, 3 years after Bard's Tale? Because I did Rags to Riches in between. By now, we're up to 640, 480 resolution with 256 colors. That was a huge leap up. That's almost 5 times. It's between 4 and 5 times the resolution of 320, 200. But to do this mode, which is called Super VGA, you had to bank switch because the PC could only access 64K of memory. And that mode required 4.5 times that much memory. So you had to bank switch. There were the first few scan lines would be on one bank, and then the next set of scan lines would be on the next bank, and the next set of scan lines would be on the next bank. So depending where vertically on the screen you were drawing a pixel, you had to tell the video card, switch to this bank, now I'm going to write into you. When we did Fallout, every video card bank switched differently, and you had to learn that and do it in assembly. No option, which meant you had to ask the consumer, what video card do you have? Hope they knew. And sometimes it was different. It was, do you have a Trident 9600 chipset A? Do you have a Trident 9600 chipset B? Do you have a Trident 9600 chipset C? They bank switch differently. If you didn't know, you could ask it to auto detect, which was not super 100% reliable. Or you could just ask them to guess, and we're going to say, guess something. I'm going to try to display a screen. Pray you don't crash. And if they could see something, then you could move on. Luckily, VESA came out. VESA was the Video Entertainment Standards Association, I think. You can look it up. Anyway, VESA made things easier, but it didn't come out early enough for Fallout to fully take advantage of it. We shipped with a Super VGA VESA driver, and we recommended that people download one if this one wasn't appropriate for you. So then you could just say, I'm in VESA, go ahead and play. That worked better than trying to guess, but still. Also, we discovered Fallout was the one and only Mac game I made, because when a new Mac OS would come out, all the old software would break. There was no backwards compatibility, and Apple cared very little about games. I could do a whole video about that. I'm not going to, because I don't really care about Apple. I mean, I have an iPhone. I love it. But I'm going to show as much interest in Apple as Apple ever showed in my games or the game industry, which is very little. But whenever a new Mac OS would come out, it would invalidate the game. In fact, like I said in another video once, people can play Fallout easier by playing the Windows version on a Mac under an emulator or a partition where you've installed something to run a Windows-like OS better and easier than trying to get the Mac version running on a Mac. So by the time Arcanum came out in 2001, we had upped the resolution to 800 by 600, still 256 colors, but it was VESA now, and VESA made everything easier. VESA cards usually shipped with a VESA compliant driver, meaning you could just tell the card through a VESA set of interrupts or API function calls. Also, all you need to know is, hey, I want to run 800 by 600, 256 color, and it would go, I gotcha. It's set up. And then as you wrote to it, you could just call a VESA supplied bank switching routine, and it would say, I'll figure out how to switch banks for you. Rock on. By then, we weren't doing Mac versions because I was like, I'm done with this. But the Windows and especially DirectX versions kept updating. Literally, while we were making the game, new Windows would come out, new DirectX versions would come out, and it was hard to keep up. Now, yes, Windows had backward compatibility, and that helped. That lets you run games. It still lets you today run games from a long time ago, but it's not perfect. It can be a little janky. It can cause some issues in HUD and frame rate and things like that, but it works. However, I'll give you an idea. just when we were making Arcanum, we started on Windows 95 and Windows NT, but then Windows 98 came out. And then Windows 98 Second Edition came out. And then Windows 2000 came out. And then Windows Me came out. And then right when we shipped, Windows XP came out. We had to check all of those. You have to check that your game works on all of them. And not just does it start, but does its frame rate good? Is it stable? Do some of the calls you're making into that version of the operating system still work? And that was a pain. By the way, Windows cycled a new version every year. A new version of XP came out every year for the rest of the time we ran Troika, from 98 through, well, the first XP came out in 2001 through 2005 when we shut down. There was just a new version of XP every year. It's hard to keep up with that. But keep in mind, I'm just describing making games that are 2D. Temple of Elemental Evil was our first game that had 3D video graphics usage. The backgrounds were still 2D, but we had a 3D collision mesh and we had 3D characters. So we had to go through the 3D API on the card, and a lot of video cards came out 3D. They all did 3D slightly differently. You tend to go through DirectX and do it that way, so you had to handle that. Well, then when we did Vampire just a couple years later, it was all 3D. And yes, we used an engine, but everything was 3D then. It was learning a new way of making a game. You had to worry about, polygon count, your texture sizes, all these things that you didn't worry about on 2D because that was rendered into sprites, and then you just had to worry about how big the sprites were. In 3D, you have to worry about a lot of other things as well. Keep in mind, too, that for the programmers and the level designers, suddenly math is super important. You could probably have gotten by in the video game industry with no math if you were like narrative or even art. Nope, not good enough. Trig was probably helping you out there. Sines, cosines, angles. But once you went 3D, artists, programmers especially, you had to know linear algebra. You had to know vectors. You had to know matrices. And you had to know them well. So that was a huge shift in the industry. Luckily, I'd gone to engineering school. So when suddenly people were talking about vectors and quaternions, I'm like, yeah, I know that. I knew programmers who didn't. And they stayed 2D. I don't want to stay 2D for the rest of his career. For the next 20 years, he just stayed 2D. Notice I haven't even touched on languages. My first game was in C, Grandstand Bridge. Every game was in C until Vampire, which was in C++. It stayed C++ until my first Unity game, Pillars of Eternity, which was C#. But then when we did Outer Worlds and Unreal, we were back to C++. I'll do a whole video on that. I've talked for a long time. I could do a whole video on languages. But let me touch a little on engines, because I do have a video on game engines. I made my own engines from the very beginning in 81 all the way through to 2011. I made my own engine, with one exception, Vampire Bloodlines, which was on the Source engine. And that was from 2001 to 2004. So then when I got to Obsidian, they had some of their own internal engines that were proprietary. So just so you know, we made South Park was made on an engine that they had made to do Dungeon Siege 3, even though the two games don't look at all alike. But once I did that game and we switched to Pillars, then it was on Unity. We were using someone else's engine, and Unity doesn't give you source code. So you basically did whatever Unity said you could do, and if you couldn't do it, you'd ask them, but who knows if it would get done. Then finally, Outer Worlds, we switched to Unreal. Whole new engine. You had to learn a whole new way of doing things, different language, C++ from the C# in Unity, and you had access to the engine. So if there's something you wanted to do, you could change the engine. But from then on, you were responsible for that change. Whenever you got an update to the engine, you had to fold your change back in. You had to merge it. It's the whole thing. Programmers know what I'm talking about. So this has been a long video. Let me just sum up. Technological evolution has been going since the first day I was in this industry in 1981, all the way up through now in 2024. It never ends. You need to accept it and get used to it. For anyone sitting there right now, no, Unity will be around forever. Unreal will be around forever. No, it won't. And you're already starting to feel that maybe those things aren't going to be around forever. So new engines will come out. They'll get displaced. They won't keep up. Or they're changed so dramatically from one version to another, you have to relearn everything. So I'm just telling you, it never ends. This is both exciting because you get to learn something new literally all the time. It's also stressful because you have to learn something new all the time. And I can't think of, nobody's really immune to this. You may think, I'll do narrative design. You get more dialogue. Now there's voiceover. Now there's lip syncing. These are all things that factor into what you're going to do. There's no escaping it. So my take on it is embrace it and love it, because that's what this industry is all about, technological evolution. So I hope that answers your question. David Deckham, 411.